Well, the story really starts when I came to West Orange in the first place. I came to West Orange right after Sukkot in 1983. I had gotten a job at what was then Sandoz, and we were looking around for a place to live which had shuls and a mikveh, etc., etc. And West Orange presented itself very favorably, and we found a nice house which was within walking distance of what were then the two shuls in town, one of them being AABJ&D, and the other one being Beth Israel, which at that time was called the Young Israel. And it was nice. I could go to shul in the morning and then go off to work. Well, I had a neighbor diagonally across the street from me by the name of Alan Schur, and he had a fairly large family. And after a while, another person moved in next door to me, and that was Meir Schechter. And he also had a large family, and the kids of all our families became friendly with one another. And Alan and Meir both had visions for the community. At that time, the community was pretty much concentrated, as you could imagine, around AABJ&D and Beth Israel, which were really within 2 blocks of each other on Pleasant Valley Way. So you had a lot of people moving in, and on my street alone, Porter Road, you eventually had something like 10 Orthodox families. Well, Meir had a vision. He had a vision of West Orange becoming kind of like Baltimore, where you pass people on the street going to shul. He wanted to have shuls in all directions, so that people could go to various shuls and pass one another in the street on Shabbos and wish each other a good Shabbos. And I could see the wisdom in that. It sounded like a good idea to expand geographically the Jewish neighborhood, because with everything concentrated in one place, the housing would become very difficult. I mean, there was only a limited amount of housing available, and if everybody wanted to live close to the shul, and there were only 2 shuls within 2 blocks of each other, it didn't leave a lot of leeway for people who wanted to maybe live a little bit further away. And particularly underserved was what was called North Pleasantdale, north of Eagle Rock Avenue. Now, everybody knew about Elaine and Herman Sherman. Elaine, who's one of the honorees tonight, ran a kosher food emporium, so to speak, out of her garage using a big freezer. She would get kosher food from, I guess, New York. Elaine can tell you more about it. And then she would sell it out of her freezer. So she was basically in the catering business. And after a while, they opened the Gourmet Galaxy, but that came a little bit later than that. Anyway, people had visions about expanding the Jewish community. And several of us, including Alan Schur and Meir Schechter, were proponents of that idea, and they talked to me about it, and I was in favor of it as well, because I felt that it was important that the community expand somewhat. So we started having meetings. We met sometimes in Meir Schechter's room, and very frequently we would meet in Steve Flato's living room, and Steve, of course, is one of the other honorees tonight. And eventually, we came up with the idea of starting another Orthodox Jewish congregation. And that's what we called it. We called it the West Orange Orthodox Jewish Congregation, or WUJIC for short, which immediately caused a furor, because people were saying, now wait a minute, you can't be the West Orange Orthodox Jewish Congregation. And we were thinking, gee, should we call ourselves the third West Orange Jewish Orthodox Congregation? Anyway, we came up with the name, and that was, from the very beginning, that was a point of contention. So, we took it in stride, and we knew that in order to really have a shul going, I mentioned Elaine and Herman Sherman before. Elaine and Herman Sherman had actually been running a minyan in their basement on Friday afternoons for people who didn't want to walk all the way from North Pleasantdale down to ABJ&D or the Young Israel to Dublin. So they had started a shul there, and this was completely with the acquiescence of Congregation AABJ&D. I believe they provided some of the Sephorim. Not sure where the Sefer Torah came from. I have to be very frank about this. Since I lived in the south end of town, I never actually attended the shul that was in the basement of the Shermans. But once we all started getting together from various parts of town, really Steve Flato's house became the headquarters. And we engaged a rabbi. The first rabbi whom we engaged was Rabbi Bomrand. was, and I think still is, a teacher at JEC. And his father had been a Rav in a shul in the Lower East Side. And Rabbi Baumrand was approached by us soon after his father was nifter. And he took this as a sign that he was supposed to become involved as being a pulpit rabbi as well as being a rabbi in a school. And he became our pulpit rabbi. He came every Shabbos and he gave a shiur, and that's the way things started out. But we knew we needed some kind of a place to daven in. So we looked around, and a house became available on Pleasant Valley Way at 217 Pleasant Valley Way. Now, this particular house was well suited to be converted into a shul because, first of all, it had two driveways. It had a very long driveway that led up to the back of the house, and it also had a semicircular driveway. And in that semicircular driveway, there was a door that led into the basement. And the lady of this house happened to run a beauty parlor down there. So she had a small, semi-separate place which was occupied by the beauty parlor, and she and her husband lived in the house above. So this seemed to lend itself toward possibly becoming a new shul. And we were able to acquire 217 Pleasant Valley Way, and we started setting up operations there. Now, some of the things that we have in shul now, for example, those candelabras on either side of the Aron Kodesh, and the shulchan, which was not quite as large at that time because the top was later expanded, and the stender, which is over in the junior congregation room, the teen minyan room, which is run by Rabbi Kirsch, who's the other honoree tonight, so now I've got them all in, nobody's left out. And also the Aron Kodesh, which is now residing in the back classroom. Those were all brought in from shuls which had gone out of business, and their material was available, so we brought it all in. And we initially set up operations in the downstairs, which had used to be the beauty parlor of this house. Well, that didn't work for very long because the circulation was kind of poor down there, and it really didn't lend itself. It didn't really have enough room. So what we did was we moved upstairs as far as the minyan was concerned. And we set up the Aron Kodesh against, like other shuls in this area, it wasn't against the Mizrach Wand as it is in our shul here. It was actually on the north end of the house. The Aron Kodesh was there, and the men's section was in the living room, and the women's section was in the dining room. It was one of those L-shaped living room dining rooms. We set up a mechitza of sorts between the two, which I think was a curtain. It was a curtain. It was definitely a curtain. It had a wide net at the top and a denser net at the bottom, so people could see, but it still was a kosher mechitza. And the kitchen was in between, and that was the place where we would sometimes congregate during the week. That's where we had meetings. That was the hub of the shul, just as the kitchen was the hub of the shul over here before we began the big expansion. And the downstairs became the place where we would have sholosh sudas. And I remember we would have sholosh sudas down there in the basement, and as we were all trooping upstairs to Daven Ma'ariv in shul, I would ask Meir what speed to sing L'David Baruch on the way to Ma'ariv, and he would tell me either to do it largo or to do it presto, depending upon how much time there was before we had to Daven Ma'ariv. So there we were, and we were in that house for a while, and pretty soon it turned out that Rabbi Baumrand really couldn't keep on. He didn't want to leave where he was living already, and he didn't want to leave his position at JEC, so it was kind of impractical to have him coming on a basis of only the weekend. We needed somebody who was more full-time. And that was when we were, with some help, there was a subsidized program for Rabbonim, we were able to engage Rabbi Stone. So Rabbi Stone was the rabbi when we got into 217 Pleasant Valley Way, and he also started teaching the Daf Yomi. That was when the Daf Yomi Shiurim started in West Orange, and that would be done in the kitchen. So the kitchen was kind of like the best medrash, as it were, as well as the main office and the place for having meetings, and the living room and the dining room were the shul, and upstairs was a place where we could either have guests Or eventually, when Rabbi Stone bought a home, and he still lives in that home on Woodland Avenue. Eventually, Rabbi Stone and Congregation Or Torah parted ways. By that time, we were known as Congregation Or Torah. The Wujik business, the West Orange Orthodox Jewish Congregation, was actually becoming much too controversial for us. So we chose another name. The name we chose was Or Torah. And I made a little joke out of it. We said, Congregation or Torah. You either come for shul, for the congregation, or you come to learn. Either one. Congregation or Torah. Either one. So anyway, we were living across the street, and at the beginning it was very, very rough. First off, we began davening only on Shabbos. We would have davening Friday night, Shabbos morning, and Shabbos afternoon. So it was basically a 2-day-a-week shul. And it took a while before we were finally able to get enough people to make a commitment to come on a daily basis. And actually it was the Daf Yomi, which was meant partly to be an incentive. So if people wanted to learn, they would come and daven, and then after davening in the morning, they could learn. So we used that as an incentive to try to get more people to come to Shacharis. But in the beginning, we were even having trouble getting a minyan on Shabbos, particularly on days when there was bad weather. And, sometimes we would be waiting at Baruch Shiomar in order to, or at Baruch Hu, waiting to get a minyan so we could say Baruch Hu. And, people would be walking down the street on their way to one of the other shuls, and we would be out in the street saying, would you like to come in and help us out with a minyan, please? So we weren't even sure that the shul was going to be a viable experiment. And I remember one day we had a board meeting, and I decided to demonstrate in a dramatic way that we really needed to expand. So what I did was I asked how much it cost to run the shul for a whole month. The salary, the mortgage, everything else. So the board came up with a figure which represented how much it cost to run the shul for a month. And I had my tzedakah checkbook with me. And I wrote out a check for that amount, and I gave it to them, and I said, okay, what you have to do is you have to find 11 more people just like me who are going to do this on a regular basis every year, or else we're going to have to get more people here who are going to be able to become members in order to remain viable. And in this house, it probably isn't large enough. Well, Ed Kroman had joined by that time, and of course Ed lives up in Verona, so this was a very convenient shul for him. And Ed is a genius at this kind of thing, and he worked magic. And the magic he worked was the building across the street from 270 Pleasant Valley Way, half of the building became available as a rental. This was because half of the building had housed the New Jersey School of Ballet, and the New Jersey School of Ballet had moved to Livingston. The building was owned by another organization, Americana Portraits, and they were the people who were in the yearbook business. They would take photographs and they would produce yearbooks. And of course, in those days, before digital photography, everything was done through chemical photography. So it took a pretty extensive plant to do a lot of photo processing. So they had half the building, most of it was laboratory, and the part which was closest to Pleasant Valley Way, which was on a slightly different level, was where they had their offices. So Ed worked out a deal whereby they sold the entire building to us, and they became our tenants. So they were paying rental to us. Now, we had this space now over here, and the way it looked back then was very, very different from the way it looks right now. Basically, the main sanctuary, up to the point where the walls used to be, was one of the dance studios. There was another dance studio on the upper level. There were big windows. There were bars, for example, in these various places. And, it was basically a big, dusty, empty space. So we said, well, first thing we need is a bima. And basically what happened was we took a piece of chalk and we traced out where we wanted the bima to be and the shape we wanted it to be, because we wanted to have stairways on either side. And we said, this is going to be the bima. And with the money that we had put in to start up the shul, this room was finished and carpeted, And the reason that the level of this room was higher, and still is higher, than the level over in the ballroom is because these rooms were the dance studios, and instead of having a concrete floor, there was a raised wooden floor so that the dancers could dance without hurting their feet, and they would get extra bounce out of it. So that's why this level is higher, simply because there was a dance studio over here. So the floor was left as is, and it was carpeted, and the bima was set up just the way it is now. And then we had to move everything across the street, and we often did it completely by hand, including the Oren Kodesh. Now, the Oren Kodesh was not the original one. This Oren Kodesh had been bought by the members of Or Torah following Elisa Flato's martyrdom when she was a victim of a terrorist attack in Gaza. So this was an enormous blow to the entire community. It's a very long story that I'm not going to talk about right now. But eventually, to honor Elisa, the members of Or Torah all contributed money in order to get an expert to carve, really, this beautiful Oren Kodesh. And looking at it still today, it's magnificent. And we paid a pittance in order to get something this gorgeous. So it actually comes apart and goes into three pieces. So we've transported the three pieces across the street one by one and then built it up again. And at that time, we were basically subsisting upon borrowed Sifrei Torah. We had 2 borrowed Sifrei Torah, which we used. Now, already around this time, we were having difficulties when we had a large crowd, and we had large crowds on Yomim Noraim. And for a couple of years, the Yomim Noraim, we actually borrowed the auditorium of the Redwood School, and we had our minyan there. We moved the little portable Oren Kodesh over into the Redwood School, and we davened over there because school was not in session on both days of Rosh Hashanah and on Yom Kippur. So since they weren't using it, we used it instead. All right, so now we were over here in this building. The shul proper was here. It went up to where the wall used to be, where the carpeting is now different. And the lobby was out there, and there was the kitchen, and there were the bathrooms. And that was pretty much it. There was a room over here, which originally had an old broken player piano in it. That was cleaned out, and that became like a storage room. And as a matter of fact, that was the first office that Congregation Or Torah had. Around this time, Sandoz upgraded all of its computer equipment, and they were giving away computers to various charitable organizations. So I put in a bid for it. And I got 2 computers and 2 monitors, and we set them up over there. And I got some Jewish software, which is still in the Best Medrash next to the computer. That's not one of the computers, by the way. The monitor happens to be one of the ones that came from Sandoz, but not the computer. So we set up an office in there, and the sign that we had, the sign which still appears in the lobby, that had actually been acquired when we were still across the street. Because in order to get supplies that we needed for Kiddush, etc., we used to go to Costco. So we became members of Costco. And I would go to Costco, which was right near Sandoz, a couple of times a week, or maybe once a week, and just get supplies to stock the place so that we could keep on operating. And one day I happened to see these electronic signs there. And, they looked really cool. And I already had visions of the shul, like the shul that Rabbi Heinemann has in Baltimore, where he has very sophisticated computer screens which list when Sof Zman Kriya Shema is and whether the Erev is up or the Erev is down. So that gave me an idea that this might be a start for it. So I got the sign, and actually my daughter programmed the very first message into it, which still appears on Shabbos and Yom Tov, which is, "Welcome to Or Torah, sit back, relax, and enjoy the minyan." Like getting on a plane. So it started out on a small table in the hallway of the house across the street and eventually made its way above the pass-through into the kitchen, where it remains to this day. But it's powered by a computer. So initially, the cable from the sign was led back into this room over the tiles, and I programmed it from one of the computers that happened to be in this room over here. So initially, we had a big empty space, and we had a whole bunch of folding chairs, many of which were contributed by Glenn Goldberg. Those are the ones, which you'll still see somewhere around here, the ones with the red cushions. Those were the nice ones. We also had some not so nice ones, metal ones, just plain metal, which weren't so comfortable to sit in for a long time. And it used to be a ritual every Shabbos when we davened here in the afternoon. Everybody, we would daven mincha, and then everybody picked up his chair and walked out into the lobby and set up his chair in the lobby. We had a folding table in the lobby, one of the wooden ones, and we would have shalosh sudas in the lobby. And then when we were done, everybody picked up their chairs and walked back in here. And it was just basically picking up your chairs and back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. So when we had a campaign to put pews in, the pews were actually all dedicated before we even bought a single pew. Because everybody was sick and tired of schlepping back and forth with these folding chairs. So that we were able to eliminate having the folding chairs walking back and forth. We had pews in here, and the folding chairs could stay in the lobby and be set up whenever we needed them for shalosh sudas. Well, things were starting to take off by this time. We had a minyan, a dependable minyan, every Shabbos. We were able to start davening every day of the week. We had started that when we started the Daf Yomi, and over here we continued it. And it was a very rare weekday when we didn't get a minyan. We tried different times, and we finally found that the very best time was to leave just enough time after minyan so people could run across Pleasant Valley Way and get on the bus going to New York City. So we really became, in a way, a commuter minyan. And people around here who wanted to commute and wanted to daven first would park in our parking lot, come in and daven, cross the street, get on the bus, and in the evening they came back. And eventually we were able to get enough interest and enough people to set up minyanim twice a day. Basically Shacharis, Mincha, and Ma'ariv every day. And Baruch Hashem, we've been able to maintain that, and we now have regular minyanim here and a youth minyan, and Baruch Hashem, it's progressed quite a bit. So we started getting more people, and when Yomim Noraim came, it started to be a real problem. So one of the first things we had done, one of the founders of Congregation Or Torah was Bernie Sorkin. Bernie Sorkin was a wonderful, wonderful man. He was always taking trips across the Atlantic, and whenever he would go on a trip, he would always stop in the duty store and pick up a bottle of schnapps and bring it to shul. And that was the beginning of the tradition of having schnapps at Kiddush. I mean, of course, it's been a tradition for a long time. But Bernie would always bring imported schnapps, which was very much appreciated by everybody in it. And unfortunately, right after Yomim Noraim 1 year, Bernie passed away. He was apparently on his treadmill, and he must have had a massive heart attack. His wife found him. And we set up the Bernard Leo Sorkin Memorial Center, which still exists in the back of the shul, and that's where all the memor plaques are. So that was in the back of the shul, in the middle, as it is now, with doors on either side leading into the shul, and the shul was again only up to the place where the carpeting changes. And it got to be a problem on Yomim Noraim because there wasn't enough room for everybody that we wanted to have, everybody who wanted to come to Or Torah. We were getting to be a very popular location, and people were moving in, so it had had the effect that we wanted it to have. So what were we going to do? And what happened was we came up with a plan whereby we moved the memorial from where it was then over to the southern wall of the shul, and we opened up that entire section, and the bookcases were put in. And the bookcases were on wheels so that they could be moved away, and that would open up that whole center section so we could basically expand into the lobby. It was a way of having, where other shuls will sometimes have movable walls, we had movable bookcases and a hole in the middle, so that when it came to Yomim Noraim, we could expand. So that was working very well. And by that time, the rabbi here was Rabbi Horowitz. So he was always advising us as to what constituted a mechitza and didn't constitute a mechitza to make sure everything was staying kosher and kedas u'kedin. Well, that helped some, but it still wasn't enough. Baruch Hashem, we were really growing. And we had to make plans to expand still further. So the first place we expanded was into what, at that time, was the office. So I had to move. Now, another thing that happened around that time was that Americana portraits underwent a change. Chemical photography was going out of vogue, And digital photography was coming in. And for digital photography, you do not need a great big plant. So they didn't need it. They were our tenants. They didn't need that huge amount of space anymore. So they let us know that they were going to withdraw from a certain amount of that space and would only be renting what had traditionally been their offices facing right on Pleasant Valley Way. So this was going to be a big fall in our income, because our income was coming mainly in the beginning from the rental that we got from Americana Portraits, which pretty much balanced against what we were paying to the original owners in our mortgage. And the operating costs were coming from the other part of our rental, which was coming from First Mountain School, which is still one of our tenants. So this would represent a huge cut in our income, and we had to make some kind of plans and had to have some kind of way of getting around this. So at one of the board meetings it was proposed that if this space was going to become available, there were two possibilities. We could either find another tenant to rent all of this space, or we could find a tenant to rent part of the space and reserve part of the space for future expansion, because we already had visions that we could have some kind of a social hall and be able to generate income from the shul from social functions. So that office was eliminated, and what happened was we had to move the computer equipment and everything else from back here where it had been all the way over to next to the emergency exit from the social hall. So right outside the doors of the current kitchen by the social hall, there's that emergency exit, and immediately next to it, where there are windows now, that was where there was a little office already, and that was where all the computer equipment was moved, and that was where I had to bring all the wires into. So I was way in the back there. Whenever I programmed the sign, I used to have to run into the front to make sure it was programming properly, and then run back and program the sign some more. It's a matter of a journey. Anyway, we expanded and we had an annex, and this annex could be subdivided to allow for an Ezros Noshim to be put in there for Yomim Noraim, and we could expand into the lobby, we could expand into the annex. So we were getting bigger, and we now had a goal of one day having a social hall, and we could start thinking about having campaigns to raise money in order to finish off and have a nice social hall. In the meantime, we weren't having Sholosh Sudis in there anymore. We were having Sholosh Sudis in what was once called the carpeted room, which was located where now we have the auxiliary Ezras Noshim in Shul and the Bes Medrash. And behind that carpeted room, in the room where the kitchen now is, that became the new storage room. So everything was basically piled up in there, and it was pretty messy. We tried to clean it up so that the kids would have a place to play. There was also the playroom to some extent. And meantime, the warehouse remained a warehouse. So it was subdivided because we were able to find two tenants. One tenant was Gymboree, and the other tenant was Garden Academy. So they became tenants, and now we had three tenants who were providing the income. We had a social hall that we had the beginnings of a social hall we could dream, and we had an expansion of our shul, and I had an office. So we continued that way for a while. By this time, Rabbi Horowitz had moved on, and we were able to engage Rabbi Spivak, who has been with us ever since. And we were looking toward continuing the expansion and the growth and the strengthening of Congregation or Torah. So we had a building campaign, and we made things available. And basically we had a series of stages that we wanted to take things through. So the plans were changing constantly. We were going to make a social hall, which was going to be a decent social hall. It was going to be fancy. It was just going to be decent. And the costs kept on going up, and the costs kept on going up, and in the meantime, the economy started going down. And that had two effects on us. One effect was that Gymboree was no longer profitable, and they really were not able to pay the rent that they owed us. And the other one was that Garden Academy started looking for another place to move to because they felt that the rental here was too expensive and they needed help as well. So we were in a little bit of a pickle. It was getting a little bit tight, but fortunately people kept on stepping up and providing money when it was needed and dedicating things. And just through the efforts of people who saw the promise of Or Torah and saw what this place could be, said, we can make it work. We can do it. We can make this into a shul that people are going to want to attend and where people are going to want to have their simachot. And we got a social hall, and it was just magnificent. Now, we're all sitting right now, enjoying the 18th anniversary dinner. Now, let me back off a little bit and talk about the Aron Kodesh and the Sifrei Torah in the Aron Kodesh. As I said, we started out with a couple of borrowed Sifrei Torah. And if you look at the pictures in the hallway, many of which Glenn Goldberg prepared, you will see the Chanukah Sabayas over here, that we were carrying a number of Sifrei Torah from across the street over here to this building. Those were all borrowed. But there were two of them that were on kind of a permanent loan, and we had 2 Sifrei Torah, and 2 Sifrei Torah is good. Unless, of course, you have a Shabbos when you need to have 3 Sifrei Torah, which doesn't happen all that frequently, but sometimes some of the Shabbosos before Pesach, if you have Shabbos and Rosh Chodesh, and one of those Shabbosos, you need 3 Sifrei Torah. And if Shabbos Chanukah works out on Rosh Hashanah, Rosh Chodesh, excuse me, you need 3 Sifrei Torah. So around the time that we moved in here, about 1999, my father was nifter. And he had always told me about when he was in Germany, his father had a Sefer Torah right in the house. And when things got too hot there in the 1930s, my father arranged through a person to have the Sefer Torah that belonged to his father shipped to Palestine, where his 2 older brothers were already living. And it never got there. That Sefer Torah was lost, and I know my dad always felt badly about it. So when my dad was in the hospital for his final illness, I talked to my mom, and I said to her, if Dad, Chas v'Sholom, doesn't survive, I'd really like to dedicate a Torah to make up for that Torah that was lost. And she asked me, well, how much does the Sefer Torah cost? And I quoted a price to her, and these were her exact words: peanuts. This is a lady who came over from Germany in 1938, literally without $5 in her pocket. And at this point, she was able to say, a Sefer Torah for your dad? Absolutely. So I remember when I was learning Daf Yomi at the time, and I dedicated a siyum to my dad. And at the end of the siyum, I told this same story, and I said that with Rabbi Horowitz's help, I was having a Sefer Torah written, and I would dedicate it to Or Torah. Jack was the president at the time, and he was literally shaking when I walked off from the bima and told him about that. So we had a dedication of the Sefer Torah. We brought it in, and that was the beginning of Sifrei Torah being dedicated by people. So after the Sefer Torah for my dad, Steve Flato dedicated a Sefer Torah in Aliza's honor, and Jeff Steele dedicated a Sefer Torah, and Ed Croman, of course, dedicated a Sefer Torah. So those are the 4 Sifrei Torah that we use, and we still have one of the loaners in there. And at this point, I'm almost ashamed to say, we don't know to whom it belongs. We would very much like to give it back, because there's room for another Sefer if somebody wants to dedicate another Sefer in the Aron Kodesh. We don't know to whom to return the loaner. So it's in there. So, of course, we need 5 Sifrei Torah when it comes to Simchas Torah. But if anybody knows where that Sefer Torah came from, please let us know so we can give it back to the owner. All right. So the Sifrei Torah were growing. The shul was growing. And it was time to expand again and to build the new social hall. And that, of course, meant I had to move the office because the office was going to be wrecked in order to make room for the new social hall. So I decided to compress things somewhat, and I set up a makeshift office in the kitchen. So now the wire just don't have to go over from the sign, but of course the computer would be used for other things because we started upgrading. We did a lot of upgrading because we wanted to have the services that any shul would have for its members. So one important service was an answering machine. And we had an answering machine still in one of the cabinets in the kitchen. Just a basic old answering machine, leave a message. But we also wanted to be able to send out messages. We wanted to be able to inform people if the Eruv was down, or if Chas v'Sholom there was going to be a Shiva, or for a Simcha, or anything else to let the people know. So Stu Rosenblum's father, I think, was in the repo business, and he had repossessed a tape-driven machine which could send out messages. I think it might even be somewhere in the back. It worked, but only barely. The tapes kept on sticking, so we would have problems with trying to make these calls to all these people on the list. It really didn't work very well. So I found a company that made a board that would fit into a computer and would automate the process so we could do everything electronically. We wouldn't have to do it with tape drives. There was just one problem. Once I got it, it turned out that it didn't fit in any of the computers that I had gotten for free from Sandoz. So what happened was that Sisterhood had to actually donate a new computer to Shul to have a computer that was compatible with this board. And that was how Kolrina came into being. So we started out, it was entirely Shul-based. It could be accessed from the outside. And I remember every Friday afternoon, I would program all of the mailboxes. I'd have one mailbox so you could find out if the Eruv was up or down. And I'd have another mailbox which would tell you when davening was. And it worked. It worked for quite a while, but eventually we went to the present Kolrina, which is entirely cloud-based. It's outside of the physical facility, and that facilitated a great deal because it could be accessed from anywhere, and it became a lot more versatile, and it's now the... Okay, so everybody knows about this. Well, first of all, this is a cookie pan, but it's metal. And the reason I got it is because it's magnetic. So in Radio Shack, they make these magnets which are specially designed for you to put a business card on. And they're magnetized in the back. You peel it off, it's sticky, and then you stick the business card on it, and that way you give out your business card and people can stick it up on their refrigerator. So my idea was to get some business card type printing stuff, which I was using anyway because that's how we print out the Aliyah cards every Shabbos. And instead I printed on them 4 each of all the numbers in the number system, 0 through 9. And originally we did this on Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur, so we had 2 of them. I'll turn it around. One for Birnbaum and one for Art Scroll. And I would put them up and change the numbers so people could keep their places in shul. And everybody appreciated that. I mean, I don't know about everybody, but people would come to me and say, thank you very much for putting up the page numbers. I was able to keep my place. So I expanded it into everyday minyanim, or Shabbos minyanim, and instead of having Art Scroll and Birnbaum, Siddur and Chumash. So that's how the sign came to be. And basically I tried to operate it so that people know what the proper place is. The ones which show the figures and all that. And I say, do you know where one's available? Because all the ones that I am familiar with were all custom made. So still people are saying, well, why don't you get something better? Well, I hate to spoil the surprise, I am working on something better. And I actually have the materials for making it. It's just a matter of putting it all together. I didn't want to do it with the long strips with all the numbers on it. I wanted to do it a little bit more sophisticated than that. And what I was thinking of was using something along the lines of the boards in train stations that announce what track the trains are leaving on. It's called a split flap board. There's only one problem. Split flap boards are virtually extinct because train stations don't use them anymore. Now they have electronic displays, which is much lower maintenance, much easier to do. And I was trying to find an old split flap board, and I could not do it for the life of me. Well, I found something. Train stations no longer use split flap boards, but there is one thing which does still use a split flap board. Cricket. When people play cricket in Great Britain, the scores are displayed on split flap boards. So what I have done is I contacted a firm in Great Britain, and it cost about £750, and that's a lot. But I got 4 split flap boards, which I am trying to put together into a new number display, which will have 4 figures and be run by pulling down on a string that will be suspended from it. So it will be mounted high enough so everybody can see it from every part of the shul. It'll be much larger than this. And it can be operated from ground level. So hopefully I'll have that set up in the near future in the shul. Now another thing about davening in the shul is there's always been a conflict. We want to be complete, but we don't want to take any chances on tircha de tzibura. We want things to happen, and want things to happen rapidly. So initially, what we used to do is we used to have the cholim and the cholos. So we would have a list for the shul itself, and I would also download lists from the various divrei Torah that were available online. They would always have lists of cholim and cholos. From Esha Torah, they would have these lists of cholim and cholos. So I would print them out, and I would actually read them on Shabbos. Now you can imagine, that starts getting pretty long, and people started complaining to the ritual committee that davening was taking much too long. So we started modifying things. So one thing we modified was that we were going to say the thing for the cholim and the cholos, but we wouldn't say the names. We would just say, put the name in, and everybody would say the names silently, and I would silently read the list of standing names for the cholim and the cholos. And then people started complaining, well, we need to space it out. So that's why we do the cholim and the cholos after Revi, and we do the other ones after Shishi. So here again was an issue. So somebody had a mishaberach for prisoners of war. And the prisoners of war, unfortunately, changed. Occasionally, terrorists would kidnap more members of the Israeli army, and they would be included in there. And always in that was included Achenu be'Iran, our brothers in Iran, because there were a large number of Jews who wanted to leave Iran, and of course were not allowed to do so by the fundamentalist Islamic government. So, I wanted to include the people who had been taken from the Army of Israel, from the IDF, and I wanted to include the people from Iran. So I started saying, I was saying this in honor of people who were, or for the benefit of people who were unjustly imprisoned, because in both cases, they were imprisoned and it was unjust. It's unjust to keep a person in a country and not allow him to move out, and it's unjust to kidnap somebody and keep him against his will as well. So that just became the parlance that I was saying, unjustly imprisoned, unjustly imprisoned. So at the 13th anniversary of being in this building here, Rabbi Spivak had a contest, and in this contest he asked questions to trivia, and one of the trivia was, what does Mark Grebenau always say before he makes the prayer for the imprisoned soldiers? So the very next Shabbos, I said, and now we're going to say the prayer for those who are unlawfully detained. And I started varying it after that. But, yeah, I fall into certain habits, can't help that. Another thing that we did at one time is we have the prayer that we say for the members of the IDF. And people started complaining that, okay, we're saying it for the IDF, but what about our own American soldiers? And yeah, that was that was a good point. So I found a prayer for the American soldiers, and I started saying that in addition. And of course, the complaint now was, okay, it's taking too long again. So I tried to combine the two of them, and it really didn't make a lot of sense. I just put in a word about, right after the IDF, I mentioned the Army of Artsot Habrit of the United States. But then it says, on guard of our territories, and it referred to things like the Golan Heights, etc., which doesn't make any sense because there are no American troops posted in Israel. It's only the IDF. So that's when we got the idea of incorporating the bracha for the Army of the United States in the prayer for the government of the United States. Now we've put in that thing there, and that's how things are right now. So hopefully everybody's happy. It doesn't take too long, but nobody's forgotten and nobody's left out. So that the Misra Pasuach is out here in front. There we go. All right, so the thing about the sign is the sign needs a serial interface, and they don't make serial interfaces anymore. But I have this docking station which has a serial interface. No. This is one of the monitors that I got from Sandoz. And makes it possible to use it. So without a parallel interface, you can't use this version of the Encyclopedia Judaica. So here we go. The boards need to be set in a little bit more firmly.
Shalom.
Did you get it? So this is part of the software also, that when I got the software from Dafka, it included these applications. The time is all wrong, so something's gone wrong with this thing. I need to sit down one day and just take it apart and back together again with all the boards firmly set where they should be. This is a very slow machine.
Gute Nacht.